chapter 13, and I would like everyone in the beginning to be reading, if they can, since we have tablets, and Henry has one anyway, the New King James Version. I don't want us to cheat. We're in Acts chapter 13. I want us to read, for now, just verse 20. Can you see, Naomi? Or do I need to go back to Tim? Or any version that's not the New American Standard or the English Standard.
Sorry, where are you at?
Acts 13, verse 20.
After that, he gave them judges for about 450 years until Samuel the prophet.
Okay. Now, when you just read that verse, you probably don't see much of a problem with it. But when we came across that verse in our podcast, of course, we had already done all the way up through the end of the book of Judges. And on the podcast, of course, we had timelines up there. And when you find out, when you go through the timeline like we'll do in a minute, we got a little bit of a problem with this passage that a lot of people love to point out. If we were given a question, say we were, it was brought to our attention, the verse 20 seems to have a contradiction. What should we first do when we're approaching this passage? If we have a question about it, what's the first thing we should do? I stress this all the time.
Look at the context.
Look at the context. So let's back up in the context and see if that answers our question. It may, but it may not. And it's important that we examine the context so that we can understand, okay, maybe there's a clue given in the text as to what's going on. So let's back up to verse 13, and we're going to read through verse, let's read through verse 20. We'll do 3 verses each. We'll start with Tammy and go through verse 20.
Now when Paul and his party set sail from Paphos, they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem. But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch of Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and sat down. And after reading the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent to them, saying, Men and brethren, if you have any word of exhortation for the people, say on.
Then Paul stood up and motioning with his hand, said, Men of Israel, and you who fear God, listen. The God of this people Israel chose our fathers and exalted the people when they dwelt as strangers in the land of Egypt, and with an uplifted arm he brought them out of it. Now for a time of about 40 years he put up with their ways in the wilderness.
19 and 20.
And when he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land to them that not met. After that, he was in judges for about 450 years until Samuel the prophet.
Okay. So, if we read that passage in context, I know Paul's sermon goes on, and he's bringing it forward to the Messiah. I do like to note here that a Jewish synagogue service is structured as far as they read the law and the prophets. They would have done that. But at the end of the service, it was an open forum almost. Anyone have a word of exhortation, say on. And we have very structured services, typically today, where everything is organized. We do have this, but it's very rare we have what I would call an open forum where anyone can get up and say anything. Would it be wrong to do that?
Well, no.
No.
But it's decent in order.
As long as everything's decently in order. And Paul lays out in 1 Corinthians 14 that it shouldn't go on forever. At most 2 or 3. So in other words, we shouldn't have just a parade of people each speaking for 15 minutes, and we'll go till no one wants to speak anymore. We don't need to filibuster our services. We don't need to go on, even though I would agree that there's never too much learning of God's Word. There is only so much we can take in at one time. And when a preacher goes on forever, and I've done that too in the past, where the sermon's been exceptionally long, it's been tough for me to break it, where I can get feedback from the audience. That was just a lot. That was a lot to take in such a short period of time. And fortunately for us, we can record the lessons. If you want, you can go back and listen to them again. But I can understand how, if you speak for 50 minutes, especially on a deep topic, you could run into problems. But that was just an aside. That has nothing to do with with our question. So, if we start in verse 16, what's Paul's main topic to begin with? What's he doing? Where does he start?
It's a bit of a history lesson.
Alright, so it's a bit of history. Where does he start in verse 17? Where does that history lesson start? I'm not talking about a year, but time.
Egypt, when Israel was in Egypt.
Alright, so he starts, God of our fathers, the God of this people Israel chose our fathers. So he does start with Abraham, but he sort of glosses over Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And it really does start with Egypt. And what's special about Egypt?
That he brought them out of it.
Alright, he brought them out of it. Where was he taking them? Canaan. How long did it take him to get there?
40 years.
40 years? Why? It's not that far from Egypt to Canaan. I don't remember why.
That was because of their sin.
Their sin, and not taking the promised land the first time. Had Israel taken the promised land when they were supposed to, it would have been 1 year. And that year was only because they were up on Sinai for a year, receiving the law, building the tabernacle, and as far as they were ready to go. And if people would not have feared the giants and the people of the land, taken the land the first time, they would have had they wouldn't have had the 40 years wilderness wandering. It was not foreordained, but they did. So 40 years. What happened after they destroyed the 7 nations of the land of Canaan? According to verse 19.
He distributed their land.
He distributed their land by allotment. End of the book of Joshua would deal with that. And then what does verse 20 appear to say?
Who gave them judges to rule over them?
For
450 years.
For 450 years until when?
Samuel.
Sin. And we know he's about to go into Saul after that, and that's why he broke it up there. So, if we add up the years there, just the ones on the page, what do we come up with?
490.
490 years. So we had 450 and another 40. So 490 years, almost 500 years. I actually went this afternoon, well, more this evening just before we came, and created a visual for us. What appears to be happening is this. So the period of the Judges, if you listen to our podcast, begins around 1350 BC. Joshua dies in around 1374 BC. He was spent about 25 years in the Promised Land. And then there was a period of time, you read the beginning of Judges, where at the beginning of the Judges, it is said that Israel, the generation that grew up, first of all, the generation that grew up in the days of Joshua served God for their lives. It was the generation after Joshua that went off into idolatry. But if you read, I think it's Judges 3 or 4, when you start getting into the actual judges, there was a generation in Israel that did not know war. And the only way that could be is if there is a gap between the beginning of Judges and the beginning of Joshua. Or sorry, the end of Joshua and the beginning of Judges. And so if you listen to our podcast, we determined that that's about around 1350 BC. And the way we got to there is by actually starting with dates we knew and back up all the way there. But, so we start 1350 BC. Now remember, we have to get 590, by this time, we can subtract off some years. But we have to at least get to 450. Well, if you read through the book of Judges, you're going to come up with a date for Samson's death. Samson is the final judge before Samuel that's listed. And if you read 1 Samuel, actually, Samson and Samuel actually overlap quite a bit. And the story of Samuel makes a lot of sense when you realize Samson is in the same time frame. The Philistines are the enemy in both stories. And so the date for Samson's death is around 1078 BC. That's a period of 272 years. Now already you probably can see a problem. We need 450. We don't need 272. Well, you can add some time. Saul's reign began around 1050, 1052, depending on, I think it's more 1050, but it's somewhere around there. Well, that adds another 28 years. All right, so in total, we're up to 300 years. 300 years. We know 300 years is not 450 years. Not even if you round off. Well, perhaps, so some people come along and say, well, maybe the 450 years include another time period. So let's move our timeline down. Exodus is about 1446 BC. Well, that to the time of the Judges can add another 96 years, giving us a total of, well, I should say, that should be 90. I forget how I did my math. There's 94 years. I think I put one date a little wrong. It should be 394 years. I can't do math. But whatever it is, it's not 450. Whether it's 394, 396, it's not 450. You would round 394 off to what? 400. If you're going to round off to the nearest 100. And no one would come along and round that to 450. So we got a problem here of this time period. And on its face, when you look at the Old Testament record, you look at the New Testament verse that Paul said here, it really does look irreconcilable. You can't even go to archaeology, because what we're dealing with here is the Bronze Age. Around the Bronze Age collapse, there's really nothing that we can anchor and say, okay, this had to be this year. I talk to my brother about this time period all the time, and he's the Egyptian. He takes a look at this time period from the Egyptian kings. And even he will admit there can very easily be a missing 50 years, 100 years. You're not going to get much more than 100, maybe 150 years. And the reason is the records that we have may very well not be complete when it comes to secular history of other nations. We have a lot of history when it comes to Egypt. But is the Pharaoh of the Exodus named by name? No. In fact, if you read Exodus 1, 2, and 3, you're going to find there are 3 pharaohs there, not one. There's going to be the Pharaoh in the beginning of chapter 1. There's going to be the Pharaoh that commanded that Moses be killed. I think that was the Pharaoh that commanded Moses be killed. Then there's going to be a second Pharaoh. That's the one that Moses ran from. And then there's going to be a third Pharaoh for when Moses returns, because Moses didn't return until the Pharaoh he ran from died. And so everyone comes along and says, well, who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? And Ramses is put up there. Moses the third is put up there. This king's put up there. That king's put up there. But really, the reason those kings are put up there is because we have decided, based on biblical history, that 1446 is the date of the Exodus. If that 1446 is wrong, then the Pharaoh changes. But if the Egyptian history is wrong too, the Pharaoh can change as well. And so we really can't come along and say, well, maybe, just maybe we can find a date that can help us harmonize these things. That can give us, maybe the biblical record is missing a couple judges, which is, of course, possible because remember the book of Judges isn't saying this judge begat this judge. It's not like Kings, where it was passed on from father to son. So you could come along and say, well, maybe there's some period of time missing in the book of Judges. But when you read the book of Judges, it really does become hard to start adding a bunch of time in there. In fact, when you add through the book of Judges, you're going to find that there's actually too much time in there. It's not even 450 years. I think it's about 500 and some years. But I want us to get the top number. The other reason why this number is a problem. Let's go back to 1 Kings chapter 6. 1 Kings chapter 6. And verse 1. Naomi, if you can get that.
And it came to pass in the 480th year after the children of Israel had come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord.
Okay. How many years since Israel came out of Egypt?
It's 480.
480. Remember, from the period of Judges to Samuel was 450, according to Acts 20. We know Saul, from Acts 13, the very next verse in Acts 13, Saul reigned 40 years. From 1 Kings 1, David reigned 40 years. And by 1 Kings 6, Solomon had reigned 4 years. That's 84 years. And yet this is the 480th year. And so we've got a problem here. We've got a problem here with dates, or at least an appearance of a problem. What is another thing we can do when it comes to the Bible that we have learned in this series when we run into these types of difficulties? What is the suggestion, seeing as how we live in 2023? What can we do only when it comes to the Bible? I don't want us to go to commentaries. I don't want us to go to learn Hebrew or Greek. We can do something in English that might help us out. I sort of alluded to it at the beginning when I told you what I wanted you to do.
Check other versions.
Check other versions. See if maybe maybe there is a mistake. Because remember, we're dealing with numbers. I don't know how many times we've run into scriptures where numbers were not copied correctly, or a phrase might be changed slightly, and it changed the meaning. So now I'd like us to go back to Acts chapter 13. And I would like us to get either in the New American Standard or the English Standard Version, verse 20. And I think we're to Bill.
Verse 20?
Yeah, in either the New American Standard or the English Standard.
The New American says, after these things, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet.
Okay. Did verse 19 have the number of years? Okay, so read 19 and 20.
Oh, okay. Yeah, and so is 21.
Okay.
When he had destroyed 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he distributed their land as an inheritance, all of which took about 450 years. After these things, he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet, and they asked for a king, and God gave them Saul the son of Kish, a man of the tribe of Benjamin, for 40 years.
Okay, that's where we get the 40 years for Saul. 1 Kings 1 would tell us David was 40. Solomon reigns 42, but 1 Kings 6 said it was the 4th year of Solomon. We needed 84 years, but man, what a difference another version of English says. So what is actually being talked about according, if we read it in the ESV or the New American Standard? What's the 450 represent?
In the land of Canaan,
Okay,
when they took the 7 nations,
okay. Well, where's our starting period?
in the wilderness, 40 years. In the
All right.
wilderness.
Well, that's the middle period. Starts the same spot we started at before,
Oh,
which is Egypt.
right.
So let's see if this makes sense. Well, if you go back and read Genesis 15, let's go back and read Genesis 15. I'd like us to see how the Old Testament ties this together. Let's go to Genesis 15, and I would like you to read Henry. Let me see. Come on, where is it? Should have written it down. Oh, there it is. I'd like you to read verses 12 to 14. That's Genesis 15.
Genesis 15, 12, 14. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abraham. And behold, horror and a great darkness fell upon him. Then he said to Abraham, know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them and will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward, they shall come out with great possessions.
Okay, so according to God, there, how long was it to take, or was Israel to be slaves in Egypt for?
400.
400 years. So if our timeline is correct, and the Exodus is in 1446 BC, then Israel's slavery started about 1846 BC. I'm trying to find the one I want from Joshua. So we have 400 years of slavery. So far, we're doing quite good. 400 years of slavery, so far, not bad. Now, we have 40 years of wilderness wandering. We know that. And so, the destruction of Jericho is in about 1406 BC. And so we have, now how many years are we up to? We're up to 440. I can't find in Joshua this one. But it's 7 years to conquer Canaan. So Israel is at peace in Canaan when they divide it by lot in about 1399. That's when it began. That's a period of 447 years. Tammy, if you were in math class and wanted to round that to the nearest 10, where would you go? You'd go to 450. And so this is what Paul's talking about. The entire period from the slavery in Egypt through to the peace in Canaan, the division by lots, was about 450 years. And after this, he gave them judges up until Samuel the prophet. Now the question is, why? What is a possible reason as to why the New King James Version, a couple of the other versions, have it differently? And it just has to do with the manuscripts that are being used. The New American Standard and the English Standards Translation is using a different set of manuscripts than the New King James Version is. And sometimes the ESV and the NASB is more accurate, and sometimes the New King James is more accurate. But remember, we've talked many times about scribal errors when it comes to numbers. Numbers are written down in words, not in numerals. That's not the way the Hebrews wrote down words. And when it comes even to Acts chapter 13, because it's not a problem with the Hebrew, it's a problem with the Greek of Acts chapter 13. That's the problem. Obviously, there must have been a scribal error. Where you put the 450 really does matter. If the 450 is between settling in Canaan and Samuel, we got a problem. There's not enough years. But if the 450 is between the Exodus and peace in Canaan, or not the Exodus, slavery beginning in in Egypt, and peace in Canaan, now all of a sudden we got 450 years. So which one's likely correct? This one. When you use the scriptures to analyze the scriptures, you don't have to worry about Egyptian history, whether it's 100, 150 years off. You don't have to look for missing generations in the book of Judges. Maybe there's some missing years. You don't need those, because the scriptures were able to give us the answer, which is why it is important from time to time to make sure you're not becoming married to whatever version, whatever translation of the Bible that you have. There are some who come along and say, well, you can only use the King James Version. I find that preposterous, because the King James Version, first of all, the King James Version we have today is not the original King James Version. Try reading that in English and you won't be able to understand it, because it's written in Old English. And Old English has the words spelled differently than modern English does. So even the King James Version isn't the original King James Version. But the King James Version was not written until 1607. That's 1,600 years after the first century. All right, well, 1,500 if you go to the end of the first century. What were people using before the King James Version? Well, then they'll go and say, well, hey, it's based on this manuscript, the Textus Receptus. And well, you really should be using only translations that have that, but even the King James only people will stick to the King James only. They won't like the New King James at all. But it creates these problems. When we have a whole host of manuscripts, remember we talked about in the first lesson of this series, or second lesson of this series, manuscripts, and how we have some that are Western manuscripts, some are Eastern manuscripts, some are Egyptian, some are Syriac, some are Greek and Roman. More is better, because when you put it all together, you can come to the conclusion, okay, this is where the mistake had to have been. And so all of the translations that come from this set will have that mistake. But all of these other versions have something slightly different. We said no amount of doctrine is changed from knowing how many years. What was from like in Acts chapter 13, verse 20. No doctrines changed. You could come along and say, well, really, why does it matter? It matters not because of the doctrine, but because people, if the Bible can't get some basic math correct, aren't going to believe the other stuff either. If they believe Paul was the one who made the mistake, then why should I? And it's not just a simple mistake you can just write off. He's supposed to be inspired of the Holy Spirit, and the Holy Spirit shouldn't be making these mistakes. Then why am I going to believe on other things? We don't have to say, well, it's not that important. We should try not to say that, because other people will come along and say, well, that mistake's not important either. Really, why is it important at all? So yes, this has been a lot of math tonight, a math lesson per se. But it is interesting to know that you can go to scriptures and solve problems like these. There's another one in the book of Galatians, and me and my brother have vast disagreements about how to settle that one. We come to the same conclusion in the end, but it's how you settle that one and what it means. Paul, when he talks about the covenants, there's 430 years, 400 years, how that works, and as far as what's being talked about there, we're not going to do that one. But that's a fun one if you want to take a look at it. You can do a lot of the same things that we did here, and allow scriptures to interpret itself. We found out the answer, but it took some thinking. It took some study. I'm